Hey folks, Alan Manick, the Hot Rod Hippie here. In today's video, we're taking a look at the Milwaukee Tools M12 Cordless Soldering Iron. Whoa! Let's take a look at this thing. So as with any of my review videos, we're going to go ahead and cover the specifications of this, then we're going to talk about it in operation, and then I'm going to tell you what I really think of it. So let's get into the specifications of this thing. This tool measures at 10.7 inches long, but that is without the battery. With the battery in place, it's more like 12 inches long. It's a comfortable design with a rubber overmold grip that really makes it handy to hold on to, and if nothing else, it just looks kind of cool. It's got a latching switch that you can go ahead and latch on, turn on, so you can hold it in different angles, and that is really great. You don't have to hold a button or keep it depressed all the time like, say, with the M18 heat gun. It has a battery level indicator on there that lights up to tell you how much battery life you have left. 4 bars as with most of the M12 tools. There's also a heat indication light. It flashes green as the tool is warming up, and it goes solid green once the tool is up to operating temperature. When you turn the tool off, it turns red, so that you know to not touch it, it's hot. That is your continuous heat indicator for when you're not using the tool. This thing has an articulating body design with 3 different settings: straight up, then a 45-degree angle, and then a 90-degree angle. So you can get into different situations and maybe fit it places that it wouldn't fit with a full 12-inch length when it's in the straight configuration. If you buy the tool alone, it does come with the pointed tip and a chisel tip, and it's just got a quick little nut on the end for easy toolless change out of said tips. It does have a light at the end to go ahead and light up your work area, so that can be handy when you're under dashes or in tighter locations. And it has a bit of a shield design to the front of it, so that when you set this thing down on a table or a workbench, whenever you're working around, it doesn't bring the tip very close to the work surface. The tool is lightweight, weighing in at less than half a pound for the tool alone without the battery. Obviously add your battery weight for whatever batteries you use in it. If you buy it in the kit form, it comes with the tool, a charger, and a single M12 battery. They do rate this tool at a 40-minute runtime with the M12 Red Lithium Compact battery. They say this thing heats up to operating temperature in 18 seconds from dead cold to ready to go. Also, the tool is rated at a 90-watt heat output. They list the operating temperature of this tool at 750 degrees Fahrenheit, but if you actually look in the instructions, they list it at 450 to 750 degrees Fahrenheit. So quite a bit bigger range than the actual packaging would imply. So now let's go ahead and take a look at this thing actually doing its job and doing what you expect it to do, soldering some wires together. I have forced myself to use this thing continually, so I'm going to have some information for you about what I really think of it, but first let's really see it in operation. As I said, it flashes green once you turn it on until it reaches operating temperature, and then it's a solid green LED. They listed about 18 seconds to reach that temperature. In my timing with a stopwatch and doing it independently, I did find that to be pretty accurate. If anything, it might actually do it a little bit quicker sometimes. So let's see this in operation, soldering together some simple wires. Starting with 20 gauge wires from an ECM wiring harness, these should be no problem for any standard soldering iron of a pen type design. So I strip back the wires, twist them together, and I get ready to heat up that wire. Turn the tool on, put it to the wire, and start heating it up, then apply my solder as necessary. So as you can see, when I soldered those 20 gauge wires together, it worked beautifully. It went quickly, accepted solder pretty quickly, and soldered that joint neatly. As you can see, the finished joint is good and solid, it's not going to come apart, and it will hold nicely. So next, let's go ahead and use this thing on some heavier wire. Namely some 12 gauge horn wire from the horn circuit of the car I'm working on. Now with the heavier wire, obviously it's going to require more heat and more time to heat up. Now I'm going to speed this up a little bit for you because quite honestly it took a fair amount of time to heat up that wire so I could get a solid solder on there. I kept applying solder to the heat tip, trying to get it to wick into the copper wire as I was working with it, and it took quite some time. That is definitely what I found over and over again when doing heavier gauge wires, but it took a fair amount of time, something a little odd for what's rated at a 90-watt heat output. However, at the end, when I'm finished, I did have a nice finished joint. It was well soldered throughout, nicely finished, and I did keep going until I completed the solder. I did not stop when it was halfway done and good enough. I went full to the end the way I would any wiring job I'm doing. So now you've seen real world use of this thing on a heavier gauge setup and a lighter gauge setup. So what do I really think of this tool? Honestly, it's a mixed bag. The first week that I used it on the heavier gauge stuff, 10 gauge through say 14 gauge. And in that week, I was thoroughly disappointed. Especially when I was doing splices where I had more than 2 wires coming together, it really took a long time and it was frustrating. I only kept doing it because I was trying to review it. So I kept using it and it got the job done, but it took a lot longer than I would have liked. The second week, however, I used it on lighter gauge stuff, like the 20 gauge that you saw me demonstrate, and that week it really shined. I figured out the quirks of it and got it to work better on that lighter stuff, and I was impressed with it then. It was handy to be cordless, it was handy to get in a lot of different locations with it and not have to worry about dragging a cord around behind me or accidentally unplugging it. What do I mean by the quirks of the tool? Well, there's a few things to note here. First and foremost is the heat up time. They listed at 18 seconds. That's not what I found to actually be the case. I showed you it turning that LED on solid, saying it was heated up in less than 18 seconds, and that seems impressive. But that's just it, it seems impressive. The operating range is between 450 degrees to 750 degrees, which is quite a large range by the way, but solder melts at 370 degrees. However, when I used this thing, got to that solid green LED, it should have melted solder right away. It didn't. I'd stick solder to it and it wouldn't melt. It would take a few seconds before it would melt. So it seemed to me like that LED was kicking on maybe 4 or 5 seconds sooner than it should have been, just to make it seem like this thing's heating up better. But at the tip, where it really counts, it's not reaching the temperature that they're claiming in the time that they're claiming. So when I was using the tool, I would know that, and I would just wait a little past that green LED coming on to know that it was coming up to temperature, and then I would stick it to the circuit, let it heat that wire up for a good amount of time, and then start bringing the solder in. On the heavier gauge stuff, this really didn't make much of a difference, but on the lighter gauge stuff, it made a big difference, and it made it work a lot better. So now let's talk about battery runtime. Quite honestly, it's atrocious. They claim 40 minutes of runtime out of this thing, and I got nowhere near that. I used a stopwatch and I timed this thing in real world use. I got 18 minutes of battery life out of the compact 1.5 amp hour battery that I'm using on it. Maybe if you use a 4 amp hour battery, you'll get better, but the kit doesn't come with a 4 amp hour battery, and nowhere do the instructions say that you need to use one of the bigger batteries. So obviously 18 minutes is less than half of that 40 minutes that they're rating it at. The LED on the end of this thing I don't find to be particularly bright or useful. That's a pretty common trend in the lights you'll get on cordless tools. It's not something I really expect at this point because they're all pretty weak. I did find this isn't really necessarily a negative or a positive, but I really hoped I was going to be able to stand it up and leave it like that most of the time. But if it sat at any type of angle or the floor of the car I was in was a little bit rough, it would topple over. It's not weighted properly, you know, the weight's fairly evenly distributed across the tool, so it's not meant to stand up like that. I get that that's not really what they intended, it is what I hoped though. Another important note is the battery life indicator. On most of my M12 tools that works really well. On this tool, it does not. By that I mean, it would stay on 4 bars longer than it would any other position on there. Sometimes it seemed like it was on there for way too long, so I pulled the battery out and put it into one of my drills and pulled the trigger. Sure enough, it was at 3 bars on the drill. I don't know what's up with that, but it doesn't seem like the battery level indicator can be trusted on this tool as it can be with the rest of my M12 tools. So now what do I really like about this thing? Well, quite honestly, it's the lack of a cord. That is the biggest thing that stands out to me. It's the shining point of this. I used to use butane style soldering torches and I got really tired of having ignition issues where I couldn't get the darn thing to light half the time, and it got so old and so tiresome that I went ahead and just went back to corded soldering irons. This thing allows me to use basically the same function as a cheap corded soldering iron and have a cordless design so I can get into areas without having to worry about dragging a cord around behind me. I work in a very cramped space most of the time, and that is really handy for me to not have things dragging around on the floor for another thing to trip over or kick. In the end, you're going to have to decide if this is a tool for you. You're going to have to know what you're using it for. If you're using it for mostly heavier gauge wiring, like I showed you, it takes quite a long time. It doesn't work particularly well on those heavier gauge circuits. However, if you're doing the mixture of things from say 22 gauge down to 10 gauge, on the lighter gauge stuff, it works well enough that I feel like it offsets the heavier gauge uses, and I would continue to use it in those situations. Personally, I'm going to continue to use this thing. I mostly do lighter gauge wiring. I've just been doing a full wiring harness lately, so I've been doing more heavier gauge stuff, and I find that the mixture of things that I do, this thing really does meet my needs for the most part. The big thing here is probably your use and also the price. At $69 for the bare tool, that's fairly hefty when you consider that the welder that I use is only like a $25 soldering iron and honestly does better than this, just doesn't have a cordless design. For For the $129 that you're going to pay for the case, charger, battery, and tool, that's definitely pushing it in my opinion. If you don't have M12 tools and batteries to use with this thing, I would not say that buying that tool in the kit form is the way to jump into this setup. It's just not. If you really want to cut the cord, personally, I am finding that really handy. I'm just not quite sure for most folks it's going to be worth the buy-in price of these tools. Alright folks, I hope you found this video informative. If you did, drop it a like. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you think? You gotta cut the cord on the soldering iron? You gonna stick with a butane torch? Do you have some other one that I should check out, maybe versus this thing? Let me know in the comments down below. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this every week. Thanks for coming around, folks.